David Alexander Tipper, better known by his stage name, Tipper, was born in London in 1976. His older brother introduced him to dance music in the late 80s or early 90s, but he wasn't too excited about it. In a 2012 interview with Future Music magazine, he said, "I was not really a fan of the 80s electronic music and never understood all the fuss about Kraftwerk and others. It wasn't until I heard 90s rave music that my interest in electronic music was truly piqued." So after discovering his newfound love for this music, he began to DJ, playing old hardcore tracks and learning how to scratch. From there, he began his production journey. He spoke about this in the previously mentioned interview by saying, "I hustled just enough cash together to buy a second-hand computer, an Atari ST with 2 megabytes of RAM and Cubase on a floppy disk, an Akai sampler, a Roland 101, and a pair of monitors. I remember initially staying up for a week straight teaching myself how to use the sampler. It's amazing how enthusiasm can motivate a person." He soon began releasing music in the early to mid-90s under a variety of different projects, both solo and collaborative. He released music alongside some friends in 1993, calling themselves the Bomb Squad, not to be confused with the legendary Long Island hip-hop producer group known by the same name. This was obviously in the days before digital distribution, so these tracks are only available on physical records, but many of them are actually very affordable on Discogs. Around this time in his life, he was in his late teens, and he and his friends would go to a reoccurring drum and bass event in London called Speed. At the time, he was very influenced by the music and the DJs, and he decided to press one of his very first solo tracks to a single vinyl test pressing and gave it to one of the DJs to play. That DJ was LTJ Bookham, who has since performed at various Tipper and Friends events over the years. I'm unsure which track was on the test pressing, and it's possible that it's just one of the many Tipper tracks that were never released. As far as I'm aware, he had still not officially released any tracks under the name Tipper by this point, but he did release a solo project 3-track record under the name Fuse in 1995. Around this time, he was also the turntablist in a not very well-known English funk band called Peyote Train. In 1996, Tipper was scratching for a Peyote Train gig in a London nightclub when he was discovered by Richie Warren, a photographer and the founder of a brand new record label, Fuel Records. Richie Warren was blown away by Tipper's prowess on the decks, and he signed him as Fuel's very first artist. It was a perfect fit, as Fuel's slogan was "Music for Sound Systems." The first Tipper release on Fuel came that same year in 1996, the 3-track Bass Gunner EP. It's worth noting that Richie Warren was a car stereo enthusiast, and Tipper eventually developed the same fascination, which came into play a little bit down the road, and I'll go into more detail in a bit. Tipper's next release on Fuel was a 3-track EP called Six Pack, and that same year, he released a DJ mix called Creative Trip Hop on the record label known as Club Masters. Just as a side note, I won't be mentioning every Tipper release in this video because there's a ton of them, and some are very difficult to track down, especially the remixes that he did in this time period. The Tipper Archives Instagram account has incredible documentation of early Tipper releases, so if you do want to dig deeper into his discography, be sure to check them out on Instagram because I can't speak highly enough about what they're doing over there. In 1998, Fuel released a compilation called 8-Track, which features a song from Laudenham Vapor Gardens, which was a new Tipper alias. It also features a Tipper track called Twister, which samples the hit track Block Rockin' Beats by the Chemical Brothers, and was also released that same year on Tipper's Twister EP. The French car manufacturer known as Renault decided to use Twister in one of their advertisements that same year. This caught the attention of Sony when Richie Warren began to send them Tipper demos, and Sony ended up signing him to one of their label imprints called Higher Ground.
Can you tell me about that? How did that happen? What did you do?
My manager would have just sent demos and had meetings. I have nothing to do with it. He got me the deal.
Could you tell me about the label? What do you know about the history? How did it start?
Of Higher Ground, I don't know anything about it. I'm only an artist on it. I don't know how old it is when it was formed. All I know is it's part of Sony. That's all I know. You know, it doesn't matter who I'm signed to. Like I say, I'm just enjoying myself making the music, so.
From there, he went on to release multiple bodies of work while signed to the label, the first of which being Supersport in 1999. He also had 2 other releases on higher ground that year, the first being LED Down, and after LED Down was The Critical Path, which was his first official album release.
Tell me about your album. I mean, how long did it take you to make it?
It took me about 8 months to make, and I actually finished it 2 years before it was released. So it was kind of old to me by the time it came out to the shops.
For the album, he collaborated with the London City String Orchestra, as well as Deborah Anderson and Sophie Baker on the vocals. While he was producing the album, he was dealing with viral labyrinthitis from being exposed to too much loud music. Viral labyrinthitis can make it hard to hear, as well as experiencing ringing and buzzing sounds, and it can also cause a loss of balance or sense of spinning. It can also cause eye twitching, an upset stomach, and vomiting. He was also dealing with this while producing 2 other bodies of work as well, which I'll mention in just a bit. Tipper spoke about this in a 2002 interview, saying, "It ended up with me going home from the studio about twice a week as a very ill little boy." One other notable thing about The Critical Path is that the album art features the first appearance of one of the 2 fuel cars, which we'll be talking about shortly. The Critical Path got mixed responses and sold poorly, as it wasn't exactly the type of album that Sony was expecting, and they were unsure how to promote it. This eventually led to Tipper and Sony parting ways, though I'm unsure the exact time that occurred. During his time with the label, he was given the opportunity to remix tracks for some fellow higher ground artists like DJ Rap, Pressure Drop, Left Field, and Groove Rider. Eventually, the higher ground imprint was completely dissolved after releasing hundreds of tracks from 1996 to 2001. After The Critical Path, he released a single under yet another alias that same year, this time being called Diascuist, releasing on the record label Cowboy Spliff. Around this time, Fuel Records released a sound system test CD called Weapons of Bass Destruction that was given away for free when you purchased a copy of the UK auto magazine called Fast Car. The CD features 2 more Tipper aliases called Children of the Cone and Subdogs. What's interesting about these specific tracks is that they were actually just rebranded Tipper tracks. The new aliases were supposedly a way to get around his contract with Sony and release on other labels, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure about the exact timeline of when Tipper was under Sony's control, and the exact release date of this CD is unknown, so I can't confirm whether or not this was the true reason for the other aliases, but it would be a logical explanation. So here are some examples of the rebranded Tipper tracks. There are 3 of the tracks under the name Children of the Cone, and one of those tracks is called Bass Toy, which was actually just the Tipper track called D's Bass Lesson. And it has 1 Subdogs track, which is called Frequently Deaf, which is actually just End of Make Believe by Tipper. During this time period in the late 90s, Richie Warren and his team at Fuel Records were busy creating the concept for the Fuel sound system. It consisted of 2 black 1970s Dodge Challengers with Colorado license plates as seen on the cover of The Critical Path. Each car had 6 18-inch subwoofers with Function 1 tops, which would raise from the trunk using a hydraulic lift. Richie Warren was a fan of the 1971 film called Vanishing Point, and the movie poster features a 1970s Dodge Challenger with a Colorado license plate, hence the reason for the Fuel cars following suit. The earliest live appearance of the Fuel cars that I could find record of was the Berlin Love Parade in the late 90s with Tipper at the helm of the powerful sound system. Around this time, the Fuel cars made an appearance in Liverpool with flyers for the event reading, "Prepare to be disturbed. This will be played at high volume, preferably in a residential area." The cars also made numerous appearances at Glastonbury's base stage, and there's actually a really funny story that came from this. Tipper was playing a set on the Fuel cars, while the Prodigy was playing a set on main stage just down the hill, and the Fuel cars were pointed down directly towards the main stage. Because of this, the Prodigy couldn't hear themselves properly, so after about half an hour, the Prodigy's sound engineers came running up the hill begging Tipper to turn the volume down. In the midst of the fuel car era in 2001, Tipper had a handful of major releases. He released his second album, this time on Fuel, called Holding Pattern, and then he also debuted a new IDM alias called Crunch, which is a duo consisting of himself and Mike Wallace, with their first album being called One. Though possibly his most notable release of 2001 was a mix CD called Sound Off, which marked an uptick in his career. Not only did it raise the benchmark for mixing, but it also led to a spike in his popularity, and he began to get booked at clubs and festivals all over the UK. The following year in 2002, Fuel decided that it was time to bring the fuel cars to America, and they called it the Sound Off Tour with the intention of promoting Tipper's mix CD. During the tour, they went to Springfield, Missouri, Denver, Vancouver, and Miami, though I'm unsure if those were the only stops that they went on that tour. That same year, Tipper and Mike Wallace released their second Crunch album, this time being called 2. The album was released on Colony Productions, a new IDM label founded by Tipper and Mike Wallace, and the label is still releasing music to this day, though it was primarily created as a platform to release Crunch material. I want to note that Mike Wallace, who is also known as Osmetic among other names, is a member of KLO alongside Lone Drum and Cursa, and they have played at various Tipper and Friends events over the years, though Cursa doesn't perform with them live. The following year in 2003, the Fuel Cars made a return to America, this time playing in New York City. Tipper also debuted a new alias that year as well when he released the album called Cell 5 under the name Correctional Facilities, which was the first of 2 surround sound albums that he released that year. The second being Tipper's third album, fittingly titled Surrounded, which utilized Dolby's 5.1 surround sound technology. He produced the entire album on his laptop during the previously mentioned 2002 Sound Off tour, though he did wait until he got home to his studio to actually mix the album. The crazy thing is, he actually had the idea to make a surround sound album 8 years prior in the mid-90s, but it was just too expensive of an endeavor at the time. Tipper spoke about his ideas behind making this album in length in multiple interviews. When asked about the philosophy behind using surround sound, he said, "Well, quite simply, to employ a technology that can be a lot more interesting than a conventional 2-speaker setup. It's obviously a much lengthier process than creating a stereo mix, but when you listen to a surround sound mix on a well-calibrated system, then the extra hours do seem worth it." Speaking about this process in a different interview, he said, "It's been a long process, about a year or 2 of prepping tunes, the writing process, 800 hours of planning, and a couple months of mixing. You can't just sit down and start straight away. For example, you have to make sure everything is calibrated correctly and that the speakers are perfectly equidistant from each other and all spitting out the same decibel level." So I suppose this would be a good time to talk about Tipper's love for music technology, as it's something that he's been passionately outspoken about in the past, and it's also something he has been closely involved with. In 2004, he created an MP3 surround sound player that provides an immersive listening experience with just headphones. Likely something similar to the experience you would get listening to a track mixed for Dolby Atmos, but using stereo headphones. He has also used his skills to contribute greatly to the producer community. For example, he developed a plugin for Logic Pro X called Ultrabeat, and he also created sound banks for the plugin, and he has created sound packs for Reason as well. He once spoke about music technology that he would like to see emerge in the future by saying, "I'm looking forward to the abolition of computer keyboards and mice, either in favor of some gesture-based tactile interface or very sophisticated speech software. I'm assuming that even thought-controlled brain caps are not too far on the horizon. For example, a strongly flavored gesture of testosterone-based energy could translate accurately into a perfect dick-in-the-ear chainsaw bass line, or something to the contrary, of course. Also, monitor speakers that do not require the listener to be in a very specific sweet spot. I've read a couple of articles recently that are probing into this arena with some successful results." He expanded on this later in the interview by saying, "One example would be the advent of cochlear implants that enable a widening of the perceived frequency spectrum beyond the current range of 20 Hz to 20 kHz and expanded into the realms of frequency not yet perceivable. I'm talking full Android shit here. The integration of human flesh and computer hardware into a symbiotic biotech organism is what will allow for a situation where new physical limits can be reached via a mechanical augment. Nanotechnology will no doubt play a crucial role in this advancement." There is clearly only a limited frequency range in which the human ear is able to perceive sound, which evokes the question, what are we missing out on? From 2004 to 2005, Tipper toured extensively, making infrequent stops back home in London between tours and mostly just living out of a suitcase for those years. Somewhere around this time, Fuel Records came to an end, with Richie Warren entering the advanced automobile parts industry, and Tipper created his own imprint called Tipper Music. Now operating as an independent artist, Tipper self-released his first album in 2005 called Tip Hop, which has been credited with helping pave the way for the emergence of the glitch hop genre that would be popularized later on. That same year, his track Illaby from his 2003 Surrounded album was used in an episode of the popular TV show Criminal Minds. Supposedly there were more tracks used in television around this time, but the Criminal Minds episode is the only one from this time period that's actually cited on his IMDb, so I'm unsure of the others. In 2006, he released 2 more albums through his new label. First was Relish the Trough, followed by The Seamless Unspeakable Something. This is also around the time that his performance history started to be at least slightly documented, and he performed at Sea of Dreams' 7th Heaven in San Francisco at the end of the year. The following year in 2007, he remastered various tracks from his days with Fuel Records and Higher Ground and released them digitally as 2 bodies of work, and he also played a set at Shambhala that year. In 2008, he released an album called Tertiary Noise, which featured a compilation of previously unreleased tracks that he had been playing out live on tours the past few years. Later that year, he released Wobble Factor, which further solidified his influence on the emerging glitch hop scene, and he also played a set at Sustainable Digital Arts Festival in Boulder, Colorado, as well as a set at Yuri's Night in the Bay Area, which celebrates Yuri Gagarin's 1961 space mission. To be clear, Tipper was playing quite a fair amount of shows back then, it's just that not many of them were actually well documented. So not long after the release of Wobble Factor, he was dealing with health issues, so he canceled all of his tour dates and just stayed at home to work on music, which would eventually become Broken Soul Jamboree, which we'll talk about shortly. By 2009, he was back to touring, with record of shows in Portland, as well as a set at Block 2009 in the UK, which had an insane lineup featuring Aphex Twin, Hudson Mohawk, Rusko, Scream, Benga, Joker, Green Velvet, and of course Tipper. He also played at Burning Man while wearing a gorilla suit that year, and he spoke about this in an interview with Lost in Sound where he said, "Yes, it was really hot in there. If you'd look closely, you'd have seen that I removed the ape hands and was using my own, not that there's much difference anyways, opposable thumbs aside." Burning Man is something Tipper has been frequently involved with over the years, and Vibe Squad actually recalled when he first discovered Tipper at Burning Man in the early 2000s in his episode of the Mr. Bill podcast.
An art car drove by one time, and I will never forget, it was a really epic moment. We was in a circle of homies, like all on our bikes, and we're talking, whatever, and an art car drives by, and its music that it's playing is like it. And I was immediately like, oh shit, that's my shit.
Nice.
And I just took off from my homies who weren't interested and just followed the art car.
Do you remember what the artist was?
Yeah, it's part of the punchline of the story. And I, kind of ride out, spend about an hour and a half, like just going in on this. And I'm like, this is my absolute favorite shit ever. Of course, it's Dave Tipper.
Oh, fuck.
And I was like the only person listening.
Nice.
I mean, it's me and maybe one other person.
Right.
And I'm like looking around for any camaraderie, like, hey, can you pinch me? Is this what's going on? Like, this is the shit. Like, I've been looking for this.
You'd never heard about Tipper before that?
No.
The interview in which Tipper recalled the Gorilla Suit Burning Man story came about right before the release of his 2010 album Broken Soul Jamboree, where he spoke extensively about the creation of the album. When speaking about the instruments used on the album, he said, "I recorded myself playing some instruments like tabla, guitar, mandolin, and keys, and some were made programming multi-layer sampler instruments from scratch, of course. I don't use any sample loops." Later on in the interview, when asked about his reason for making music, he said, "I make music for a few reasons. The primary directive is as a dispersant for madness, or put another way, it acts as a purgative, though sometimes I question its efficacy. I'm not a particularly patient person in other aspects of my life, but I do seem to have a knack for excessive focus when it comes to music. In order to push musical boundaries, for me at least, a huge amount of discipline is required, and I can't help thinking that this quicker, faster, I want it released yesterday already make me an instantly successful superstar awesome DJ producer attitude that seems so prevalent these days is to the general detriment of musical creativity. I used to call myself a perfectionist, but it is of course a naive supposition to think that a human can create something perfect when we are inherently flawed. I just work on a track until I feel it has reached its full potential. Whether that takes months or years is irrelevant. In that same interview, he was also asked why he plays so few live shows compared to his peers, and he cleverly answered by saying, "I don't like to repeat myself. I don't like to repeat myself. It takes me a lot of time to make a track and therefore a lot longer to sculpt an entire set of music. If I play the same set to a crowd, then it ends up being less fun for them and a lot less fun for me. I don't want to bore myself or others, so I'm careful not to repeat myself. In 2010, he played a handful of US dates with appearances at Camp Bisco and Wakarusa, plus shows in Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Lincoln, Nebraska. Near the end of the year, Broken Soul Jamboree was finally released. One of the tracks on the album, Brock Inspector, is unique because it doesn't adhere to a strict time signature or BPM. Tipper spoke about this in a 2013 interview with The Ounce by saying, "I simply removed the visual grid from the arrangement page of my sequencer, which is normally used as a reference for keeping everything locked to a particular tempo, and then abandoned the traditional loop-based approach to writing electronic music and essentially treated the arrangement as one note at a time, playing stuff in manually with no metronome, using a MIDI keyboard, and then going back over it bit by bit and dragging any majorly unruly MIDI notes into a more favorable position. It's a considerably lengthy process, but can yield interesting results." So, aside from the album being released that year, he also did his first film score for a documentary about homelessness and drugs in Vancouver called Streets of Plenty. He had mentioned multiple times in interviews over the years that he was interested in scoring film, but he was just waiting for the right opportunity to come along. He has since gone on to score other films, such as Aya Awakenings in 2013, a documentary about plant medicine in the Amazon jungle, and he also scored Stephen Arnold, Heavenly Bodies in 2019, which is a movie about the life of the American artist and protege of Salvador Dali, Stephen Arnold. In 2011, Tipper began to hit more festivals like Nocturnal Wonderland, Sonic Bloom, and Earth Dance Live, plus shows in Knoxville, Calgary, Austin, plus returns to San Francisco and Denver, among others. That year he released the singles called Snake Eyes and Chrome Splat, followed by the Bubble Control EP, which was the first of 3 EPs that would be released before his next album. At the end of the year, he played 2 New York shows with Disco Biscuits and closed out the year at Snow Globe Music Festival. Moving on into 2012, he continued to play shows, and he also released 2 more EPs that year, Puzzle Dust and Shatterbox. Those 2 EPs, plus the Bubble Control EP released the year prior, feature some of his more wild up-tempo tracks, a lane that was never really explored in his albums until 2022, which we'll talk about later. The following year in 2013, he released a single called Algae Bloom and 7, which was originally intended to be a part of his 2010 album, Broken Soul Jamboree. That same year, he had to undergo open heart surgery to repair his mitral valve, so he only played a handful of shows that year, one of which being weeks before the surgery. In order to help cover his medical expenses, he released the Dusty Puzzle Box EP, which featured VIP remixes that he had been playing out live over the past few years. Addictech hosted the release, and they forewent their percentage, so Tipper got all of the money. The surgery took place on June 6th, performed by Dr. Douglas Murphy of Emory St. Joseph's Hospital in Atlanta. After the surgery, Tipper took a bit of a break to facilitate his recovery, but after that was done, his next album was finished, and on May 5th, 2014, he released the album titled Forward Escape. Many of the previously unfinished tracks from this album were actually tested out during his set at Infrasound in Wisconsin the previous year, accompanied by visuals from Android Jones. Only 300 vinyl copies of the album were made, making it one of the most difficult physical pieces of Tipper's work to obtain, with only 1 used copy of the 2014 vinyl for sale on Discogs for a hefty $2,000. However, this year in 2024, 10 years after its release, 300 more copies were released, featuring updated mixes of each track, plus a rework of the cover art by Android Jones, and those newer presses are much more affordable. Moving on into 2015, he released 2 more EPs, the first of which being called Fathoms, and the next one is called It's Like. Early in the year, he also played a down-tempo set at Alex Gray's Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, also known as Cosm, and the set was released on SoundCloud. That year, he also made returns to festivals like Camp Bisco and Shambhala, plus some new ones for him, like Imagine Festival and the now-defunct Counterpoint Festival, plus what I believe was his first ever set at Red Rocks. It sounded like a somewhat turbulent year for him because when he was returning home from Shambhala in 2015, he broke his foot in a car accident, and he was also dealing with food poisoning during his 3-night run that he did in Chicago. In April of 2016, the Tipper and Friends Full Moon Gathering took place at the Spirit of Sewanee Music Park in Live Oak, Florida, where he played a set with Mike Wallace, whom he had previously collaborated with on their Crunch albums 15 years prior. He also did a 3-night run at the Fillmore in Denver that year, with night 1 featuring a tip-hop set, and he's going to be running it back this November with another 3-night run at the Fillmore for Tipsgiving. Moving on into 2017, he released 2 new EPs, Flunked and Lattice. Tipper and Friends also made a return to Sewanee in May of that year for the Nocturnal Edition, which featured a set from KLO, which is Mike Wallace's duo that I mentioned earlier in the video. Later on in the year, during the 2017 solar eclipse, a 4-day Tipper and Friends event called the 4321 event took place at Astral Valley in Missouri. One notable thing about that weekend is that he invited Marcus King to play back when he was somewhat of an undiscovered artist at the time. It's an interesting choice, as Marcus King is a blues artist, so he doesn't exactly fit the bill of a typical Tipper and Friends lineup, but he has since grown into one of the biggest current blues artists in the world. To kick off 2018, a 4-night Tipper and Friends run took place in New Orleans called the 4567 event, with 2 nights at Tipitina's, followed by 2 nights at the Orpheum Theater, featuring immersive projection mapping from Jonathan Singer and Datagramma. Unfortunately, Tipper's father passed away early in the year, so he released a song called Cloaked in memory of him. Through the rest of the year, he made stops at Okeechobee, Summer Camp, Camp Bisco, Resonance, Sewanee Halloween, Voodoo Fest, plus 3 nights of Tipsgiving in New York City. 2019 saw the full moon return of Tipper and Friends at Spirit of Sewanee Music Park, plus a return to Red Rocks where he opened for Spangle, as well as a return to Infrasound, Camp Bisco, and Imagine Festival. On May 15th of that year, his first album in 5 years was released, Jettison Mindhatch. Moving on into 2020, the year kicked off with the second Tipper and Friends event in New Orleans, this time taking place at the Sanger Theater for 3 nights. From there, he was able to fit in a handful of shows before the COVID lockdowns, including Envision Festival in Costa Rica, Gem and Jam, and a return to Okeechobee. That summer during the COVID lockdowns, more vinyl copies of his 2010 album Broken Soul Jamboree were repressed as a way for fans to enjoy some high-quality Tipper at home since live shows weren't occurring. Moving on into 2021, Tipper's first 2 shows of the year took place at Red Rocks, featuring visuals and projection mapping on the rocks from Fractaled Visions, Droid, Datagramma, and Anti-Alias. 2 weeks later, he returned to Summer Camp Music Festival, followed by Bonnaroo, then Resonance. On October 20th, he released his most recent EP to date, the 6-track Insolido EP. The following year in 2022, Tipper and Friends made yet another return to Spirit of Sewanee Music Park, followed by sets at Sonic Bloom, Secret Dreams, and Same But Different. On October 28th of that year, Tipper released his most recent album called Marble Hunting, which is probably the most banger-laden album that he has ever made. One of the most interesting samples on the album appears in the track Knee Pads, which samples a 1972 Vietnamese song which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but check out the comparison. I'm sure Tipper has used a wide variety of samples and obscure sound recordings over the years, but they're seldom documented, and this just happens to be one of the few that is. A couple months after the album release, Tipper ended the year with a set just 1 hour into the new year at Snowda in Minneapolis. As for 2023, it was fairly quiet, with just a 3-day return to the Spirit of Sewanee for Tipper and Friends, plus a Tipper takeover at Secret Dreams, with a Tipper set to close out the festival. In early 2024, Tipper announced that he will be retiring from playing shows sometime in 2025, leaving Tipper fans in a mad scramble to catch as many sets as possible as the window of opportunity is quickly closing. Tipper said, "After spending the better part of my adult life touring and playing shows, I feel like it's time to stop. I'm very grateful for all the support over the years. It will be a wrap sometime in 2025. Peace out." This obviously brought a spotlight onto the remaining shows, which started off with Texas Eclipse, followed by Rendezvous, Lightning in a Bottle, Secret Dreams, and most recently, his first time playing in Alabama for 3 nights of Tipper and Friends at the Orion Amphitheater in Huntsville, featuring incredible projection mapping. His only 2 confirmed upcoming events are Sewanee Halloween in just a few weeks, plus Tipsgiving in Denver at the Fillmore, just like back in 2016. Aside from that, there are only rumors as to where and when he will play the remainder of his last ever performances, but time will reveal all. Tipper has existed in an interesting space within the electronic music industry, as he has naturally built a cult following over the course of 3 decades, gaining new fans by simply pursuing his own creative interests, while still remaining relatively obscure. Tipper is one of those artists where the novelty comes just as much from the experiences and community surrounding the project as the music itself. And it's all just kind of happened naturally, because he even said in an interview over a decade ago that making music was never a career choice for him. He said, "There was never a coherent decision about a career per se, as that was always a concept that seemed to be lacking in fun. Being a typical teenage raver, shaped by what was going on in London at the time, I was not particularly enamored with any sort of authority and used music as an escape hatch, still do."
Well, if they like it, that's good, that's a bonus, but if they don't, it doesn't bother me at all. You can't expect everyone to like it because it's complicated music, it's difficult music to listen to, unless you understand it, but I mean, a lot of people, it just goes over their head, so I don't know, I don't really care what anyone thinks. Seriously, as long as I'm just enjoying myself making the music, that's all that really bothers me. It doesn't matter to me whether it's underground, overground, any ground. I'll make what I make regardless. I just make music really for myself, for selfish purposes. So as long as I have fun, I don't mind.
I just want to add this in as a closing statement that this video is in no way a comprehensive look into Tipper's entire career. Rather, it's an outline of various events that have played a part in the Tipper project becoming what it is today. Although there are plenty of mysteries surrounding the Tipper project, there is a plethora of information about his story scattered across the internet, far more than what was actually covered in this video. So if you're interested in digging deeper, I've put links to all of the interviews and articles used in my research in the description.